Are you sick and tired of losing to Unchained? Well, so am I, which is why I'm bringing you the ultimate guide on how to beat it. What's up, Ocean? You got Matt here, and welcome back to another competitive Yu-Gi-Oh video. Ever since Unchained surprise wins at YCS Sao Paulo and YCS Vancouver, it's been pretty clear that Unchained has been the best deck of the meta. The deck has become extremely popular at every level of competitive play, and if you want to succeed at any of these levels, you have to know how to beat it. So in this video, I'll show you the best cards to play in the Unchained matchup, as well as where and when to use them. I'll also go over the choke points and the weaknesses of the deck itself and tell you which decks are most suited to beat Unchained. So if you're excited for the video and for this brand new series, then make sure to smash the like button. If you guys hit 75 likes on the video, I'll know that you want to see more guides on how to beat other meta decks. Also, if you like deck profiles, combos, discussions, and competitive Yu-Gi-Oh videos in general, then you're going to love the content here. So make sure to subscribe and help us reach our end of the year goal of 2,000 subscribers. Now, with that being said, here is the ultimate guide on how to beat Unchained in the October 2023 competitive Yu-Gi-Oh format. Let's jump into it. The first thing we're going to talk about is what does the Unchained player actually want to do with their game plan. But before we can do that, we actually have to go over what the deck is looking like itself. So this is what an Unchained deck is going to look like right now. You have your starters, you have your 3 copies of Tour Guide with the 1 Fiendish Rhino Warrior, you have your 3 copies of Sharvara, which is an amazing extender and playmaker, you have the 1 Shayama, which is an amazing card, as well as the 3 copies of Aruha, and the 1 copy of Rakea with your 1 Sarama. You have your Rhoda in the form of Abomination's Prison, your 2 trap cards in the form of Escape and Chamber, and of course the DDD package, followed by just a variety of consistency pieces and interruptions. This is what the deck is. The deck really looks to destroy its own cards to gain extra advantage and storm the field with the powerful Fiend monsters that eventually end up link summoning into your monsters. Did I say they link summon into your monsters? No, they link summon with your monsters, which is an amazing form of removal. The good news is they get locked into Fiends pretty quickly, but they have a variety of 2-card combos that can get you to any variety of their final end board. Speaking of the end board, what does their end board usually look like? Well, most of the time the end board is going to have a few pieces of interaction. Specifically, most of the time they're going to have access to the DDD Wave High King Caesar, which is 2 special summon negates, and I'll refer to it as just the Caesar from now on. You also have the Unchained Soul of Rage, the Link 2, which is a quick effect link summon with your cards on your turn. It does target, however. There is also going to be the Unchained Soul of Yama in the graveyard to bring back a card after destruction effect happens. There's going to be the Unchained Soul of Sharvara, which is one of the new cards, which will be in the hand usually to be able to quick effect destroy a card they control and then special into the field, and of course that'll start triggering their effects. And finally, it'll likely be one of the 2 trap cards, either the Chamber, which is a monster reborn, or the Escape, which is a target 1 Unchained card they have and 1 card you have, and destroy both of them. So those are very powerful. It's a very strong end board, but it can go into a different route as well, depending on what they want to do. Depending on when they got interrupted as well, they can end on a Nightmare Griffin linked with a Muckraker of the Underworld, which means that you're basically forcing all special summon monsters to not be able to activate their effects as long as they aren't linked, which is absolutely insane and kind of like a skill drain. Obviously, either option here is a very powerful and scary end board. So let's start talking about Handtraps and which are the best to actually deal with the Unchained deck. Well, these are the Handtraps that we're going to be covering today, so skip ahead to find out which one you want to talk about. Now, starting off, of course, we have Ash Blossom. Now, Ash would be amazing to use on Yama, but they're always able to chain block it with the effect of Fiendish Rhino Warrior or even a card like Sharvara. Usually you want to end up saving the Ash Blossom for one of the trap effects that'll special summon from the deck, unless they actually open up with Tour Guide. Now, this does open you up to Triple Tactics Talent and Thrust, which are very commonly played in the deck, so just keep that in mind. As for Droll and Lockbird, this card is not that effective against the deck. It plays really well into Droll unless you're able to get the Droll off before they go into their Yama. If you're able to Droll the Abomination's Prison or the DDD Gate Search, you're actually in a not terrible position to stop their plays from extending too much further. It does depend on their hand, but Droll does have a weaker matchup against this deck than it would against others. As for Infinite Impermanence or Effect Veiler or cards like Ghostborn, or just targeted negation in general. Now, these are good options to use on the Tour Guide or the Yama on your opponent's turn. Or they can wait until the end of the main phase, use a card like Nibiru, and then negate the Caesar to be able to stop them from negating that Nibiru, which is a very powerful play because you get to clear their board pretty damn quickly. Now, you can also use Imperm on your turn, which has a lot of usefulness. You can either Imperm to negate the Soul of Rage, which will mean they can't link summon, or you can Imperm the Caesar to stop them from actually negating your special summons, which is very powerful too. Now, it's very good if Imperm is your only source of negation, so just keep that in mind. I will say though, that it's very important, if you use Imperm on something like the Tour Guide and they have Sharvara in hand, they can just quick effect destroy the Tour Guide so that the Tour Guide effect will still resolve and special summon the Sharvara and still let them go ahead and link summon into their Yama pretty easily. So just keep that in mind. Then we have Nibiru. I mentioned it earlier, but there's 2 options for it. You can either use it in tandem with a card like Infinite Impermanence, which is fine. It'll do really good in a lot of situations, or you can use it when your opponent has access to the 2 new dogs on their side of the field, the new blue dog and the new red dog, Sharvara and Shayama, which is really good so that way they can't go into the DDD Wave High King Caesar. That's really good since that obviously will stop the negation that they're going to be getting on their turn, so just keep that in mind. But Nibiru is not the strongest since a lot of the time the deck can just play through it by having access to the Unchained Soul of Disaster in their deck, which will allow you to be able to, which will allow them rather to link summon with your Nibiru into a copy of Nightmare Griffin eventually, and that will cause you to basically be skill drained, which is obviously very problematic. Another really solid hand trap against the Unchained deck is going to be Fantastical Dragon Phantasme. Now Phantasme is really solid because your opponent link summons a lot in Unchained, so it lets you get a body on the board, but they also target a lot, and Phantasme allows you to basically get targeting protection for your monsters, like against the Unchained Soul of Rage. That is absolutely and incredibly powerful. Next up though is going to be Skullmeister. Now, Skullmeister is not my preferred way to interrupt this deck. I don't really like the card that much, but it isn't once per turn. You can basically negate any card in the graveyard, including the traps, which is really nice, and you can just stop them from doing things they would normally do by forcing them to go into different ways. If you manage to negate something like a Shayama or a Sarama effect, that's really powerful as well, because those are basically played at one copy in the deck, and if you stop them from doing those things at the very beginning of the duel, then you're in a much better position than you would be if you didn't. Next up is going to be Dimension Shifter, and I'll be honest, the card is really good against Unchained, but not every deck can play it. If you're playing like Kashtira or Flu or Exosister, then sure, play this card. Is going to get you a long way against this deck. However, they can still build a board through it, because the only cards that actually care about being in the graveyard are going to be the Shayama, number 1, which loves to be in the graveyard. If it's banished, it's basically gone. The Sharvara, so it can trigger its effect when sent to graveyard, and of course the Yama, so it can bring cards back. All the other Unchained cards don't have to be destroyed and sent to the graveyard. They just have to be destroyed, which is really powerful, so you can just play through Shifter decently well. Then we have the Bestials. Now the Bestials are fine against the deck. They have a lot of really good utility in certain situations. You really want to be able to get rid of other problematic cards like Shayama, which of course is a water monster and not a dark or a light, so it makes things kind of tough. But usually you want to end up saving this card for the Yama or for something like the Unchained Soul of Rage, which are obviously very powerful cards. If your opponent's going to be able to have the Yama engraved, and you can just banish it with a Bestial Magnemite or Druid's Worm, that's very impactful, so they can't recur their resources back. However, if they have something like a Unchained Soul of Rage in the graveyard and they're going to trigger the effect of Yama, you can just banish the Rage. But Yama doesn't target the card that it's going to bring back, meaning they can just bring back something else, so keep that in mind. Bestial Druid's Worm is one of the best cards to have against this deck because it's able to just be so impactful on so many levels. You can banish the Yama or the Soul of Rage, and when it's sent to the graveyard, you can just send a card your opponent controls to the graveyard, send a special monster to the graveyard, which is very impactful, even though it does target, so keep that in mind. Such an amazing card against the Unchained deck. And then finally we have DD Crow. Now DD Crow has a lot more application and it's picking up a lot of popularity now because it doesn't give you a body, which does suck, but it has so many more diverse options. You don't have to banish the light or dark monster. You can banish something like the Shayama, which is very strong. That means they don't get access to that for basically the rest of the game. You can banish the Yama or the Soul of Rage in this game. You can also banish the set card that Sarama would try and bring back. These are all very important interactions that you have to be aware of. And for that reason, I do see that this card is seeing a lot more play, and on top of that, it can't be just negated by the Caesar. So that's very important in this matchup as well. So in reality, to effectively deal with this deck, in my opinion, you're going to need two different hand traps that combine together very well. Whether it's going to be something like the Nibiru and the Imprint, or something like a Droll and an Ash. Those are very strong combinations against this deck. Moving on to board breakers, these are the ones that we're going to cover today. Starting off with Evenly Matched, which normally would be really good against the deck. However, they can just chain escape to it. They can pop the Rage and keep the Caesar on the board, which means that in a new chain, Yama will activate to bring back the Rage, and the Rage will target the Sharvara or another card to just add to hand for more follow-up, which is obviously very powerful, and you're basically just back to where you started without a battle phase. That's not the best way to go about things right now. Dark Ruler No More is also below average in the matchup because while it does get rid of two problems technically in the Soul of Rage or the Caesar, it's not a permanent solution since your opponent can just go for escape, pop the Rage and one other card you control, and then bring back the Rage with the Yama, and you're kind of back to square one, and you can't win the game that turn because your opponent won't take any damage because of the effect of the Dark Ruler No More. Now we have Kaijus. Now Kaijus, they're not as effective as other cards. They're good to tribute over one of the threats, but it leaves another problem on the field. If you leave the DDD, then your opponent can just negate two special summon effects. If you leave the Rage, they can just link summon with you, which is obviously problematic. Now, I will say though, it is very good in other matchups, so it's more likely to see play in those matchups than it would to be in this one here, but I'd rather have this than just not have it at all. As for Lava Golem, Lava Golem is great. It is arguably the best way to tribute over cards on the Unchained board because they are almost always ending off on two bodies, the DDD High King Caesar and of course the Soul of Rage, or they end on the Muckraker plus the Nightmare Griffin. Both those boards just crumble to a card like Lava Golem. However, not many decks can play Lava Golem. A lot of decks need their normal summon, which means it's very difficult to actually fit this card into your side deck. Now, if you can afford to play it, by all means, go for it. It'll be absolutely clutch. but not every deck can do it. As for Sphere Mode, I don't think Sphere Mode is that good at all against this deck, I should say, because it doesn't end on 3 bodies very often, so in my opinion, stick to Lava Golem or go with your Kaijus and you'll be in a much better situation. Now let's move on to cards that just steal your opponent's monsters, starting off with Change of Heart. This is a very solid card that's seeing a lot of play right now because it does take control, but it does target, so keep that in mind. It's not the absolute best case scenario because of that targeting. The fact that your opponent can just chain the escape, pop the card you targeted, and the Change of Heart means they're basically back to square one. Now, you can take the DDD High King Wave, High King Caesar, which is a really good card to take since it gives you 2 negates on the board for special summoning, and the deck, like I said, does do a lot of special summoning. It's just not as impactful a lot of the time. You really want to manage to take the link monsters because the linking off is what's really annoying in my opinion. Next, we have Marionette Might, which is really good at taking the Unchained cards, but it's super situational. So for that reason, I actually wouldn't side it unless you're expecting a lot of play against Unchained. On top of that, it does still target, so keep that in mind. If you have another card on the field, they can just do the same play I just said with the Change of Heart. Then we have Triple Tactics Talents. Now, Talents to take is fantastic because you're just not targeting to take the card, which is really strong. However, sometimes you may want to draw 2 to dig for other non-engine pieces that can help deal with Unchained. I will say that Talents to take is probably the best option, but keep in mind you have 2 or 3 really solid options depending on what the Unchained board is doing. Next up though, we have Kashtira Fenrir. Now I want us to take a minute to talk about Fenrir because this card is absolutely incredible against Unchained in my opinion. The reason being is it is an immediate threat that has to be answered to. If your opponent has a board, the board that I mentioned earlier with the Sharvara in hand, the Yama engraved, the escape, or whatever trap they have set with the Rage and the DDD, this is really strong because Fenrir does not start a chain when it's summoned, so you can't negate it with the Caesar. So if you go special Fenrir, your opponent has a decision to make. Do they let you get the search off before they go and link into the Unchained Soul of Rage? If they do that, well, yeah, you can just summon Fenrir out again. But if they don't, let's say they go right away, trigger the Rage, and link off with the Fenrir, then you manage to get rid of one of the threats already, which is super valuable. If they just let you go to battle phase, you can just attack into something, banish something like the DDD, and at that point, you're able to play the game a lot more freely in your main phase 2 while having a body on board. So just keep that in mind. Now, I do think that Raigeki, Dark Hole, Lightning Storm, all these board wipe cards have their place against the Unchained deck. Why? Well, number one, it forces out the Yama and it gets rid of the DDD. The main problem with Unchained is that they don't actually set up a bunch of negates for spells and traps. They set up negates for special summons and they have ways to deal with cards like that, but just mass removal, they don't really have an out to. So if you go for Dark Hole against the DDD and the Rage, or even the Griffin and the Muckraker, your opponent can go, yeah, Yama, bring back the Rage, but at least that way you've gotten rid of the DDD, which is a huge threat, 2 sources of interruption, and you've gotten rid of the Yama, which is absolutely critical against these decks. And the final board breaker card I have here is going to be Cosmic Cyclone. Honestly, it's back row hate that doesn't destroy, it targets, it does cost you life points, but it's really solid in some niche situations. I do think that it deserves side deck consideration. Other good cards to play in the Unchained matchup are going to be Gravekeeper's Inscription, which is just a solid card all around. Not the best, and not every deck can actually make use of it, but it does turn off the graveyard, which is really nice. And then finally, if your deck can make it, Abyss Dweller. Abyss Dweller is a fantastic card since it just shuts down a lot of different pieces that they might have. You can just shotgun it right away, or if your opponent tries to do something and have an effect trigger in the graveyard, you can chain to that. But that is pretty risky depending on if they're playing something like the Kaijus. Now for some choke points and weaknesses. Starting off, Pot of Prosperity. The deck does have some consistency issues, so it loves to play Prosperity. However, it really likes the extra deck, so it has a tough decision. Do I banish 6 or do I banish 3? Most of the time when your opponent banishes 6, they're more than likely missing a key piece to get their engine going, whether it's going to be a trap card to just destroy or a card that does the destroying itself. So I would personally Ash Blossom a Pot of Prosperity. I would not Ash Blossom it if it was for 3, but I would if it was for 6. Then we have the Shayama. If your opponent decides to use Shayama for like a link summon before they actually use its in-grave effect, I would DD Crow the Shayama 100%. That'd be so strong because they can't then access the level 6 or the level 6 pool as easily. They can get into the DDD with 2 Sharvaras, but it's a lot harder to do without the Shayama in rotation, and they lose that for the entire duel. Then we have Tour Guide. Now I would say Tour Guide is a great source of interruption and a good choke point because your opponent's either forced to burn an extender, which can force a weaker board, or sometimes it can just end their turn since they would need 2 of Aruha, Sharvara, Abomination's Prison, or the traps to really continue, which in a 40 card deck is about a 15% chance to happen if they open Tour Guide and 2 of those cards I mentioned. So not the most unlikely thing to happen, but it's a lot less likely than other situations would be. Then we have the Yama. Now, if your opponent can't successfully chain block the Yama, I think this is a great place to hit them with an Ash Blossom. It's a really solid option for that because your opponent just won't be able to do anything about it, which is really strong, and it just shuts down their access to the rest of their engine. Another weakness of this deck is going to be non-targeting and non-destruction removal. This deck really struggles with dealing with that kind of removal because all the cards want to be destroyed. All these cards want to be sent to the graveyard. If you can banish them or return them to the deck or hand, that is so advantageous. Unchained also has a hard time dealing with decks that don't special summon or with decks that are immune to targeting and destruction, which is a great segue into our next section of the video, which is going to be the best decks to play against Unchained, the decks that have a good matchup. Starting off with one of Unchained's worst matchups is going to be Floowandereeze. Now, Flunder has a really good time against Unchained because number one, it doesn't special summon. Number two, it can just play D-Shifter pretty freely. So those things right there just mean that number one, Rage can't link with it because Rage can only link with a special summon monster, and number two, it's also able to get out D-Shifter to just stop them from activating their effects of Sharvara, Yama, Shayama. All these things are really annoying, and having D-Shifter to stop that is absolutely incredible. On top of that, it can search out DD Crow pretty easily as part of its combo, which means that you can just DD Crow whatever card is super annoying and allow you to play more freely. Then we have something like Dragon Link. Now, Dragon Link is a great deck against Unchained. Now, the reason why it is because if Unchained goes first, it's very hard to beat. But if Unchained goes second, that can cause a bit of problems since basically every card you have just special summons out another card. You think about cards like Quick Launch, you think about the Bestials. These cards start a chain, which means that the DDD Wave King Caesar can just negate them and destroy them, which is obviously problematic. Now, there are some cards that don't actually start a chain. Think of something like the Baby Dragons. Those are really good. Or cards like Bestial Lubellion. Those don't start chains, but DDD is massive, 2800 attack. You can't just beat over that thing pretty easily. So you have to find a way to just get all the negates out and then go for game that way. And most of the time, they're going to have the Rage. However, if you have the ability to set up your board first, Boral End Dragon is an absolute disaster to deal with for the Unchained player because it can't be targeted by monster effects and it can't be destroyed by battle or card effects. That is absolutely insane. On top of that, it has Hieratic Seal of the Heavenly Spheres. This card tributes itself for cost and then non-target sends a card back to the hand. That's absolutely insane for the deck because you're, first of all, non-targeting, second of all, you're not destroying, which we've talked about were so good. And then it gets you access to either a Bestial Bestial Druism, which is fantastic against the Unchained matchup, or it gets you to like a Bestial Baldric, which is fine against that deck. You've already gone through all your Druisworms. Then we have Branded. Now, I don't care if you want to talk about Branded Chimera or Branded Despia, both variants are really good because both of them have access to a card like Rinbrum and Mirror Jade. Both these cards do non-targeting, non-destruction removal. Rinbrum allows you to negate extra deck monsters, then return a card to the hand, which is fantastic. And then Mirror Jade allows you to get access to a just banish, non-targeting, huge. And I forgot to mention, but with the effect of Rinbrum, if it's in the graveyard, you can banish itself and special summon back an Albaz to just start fusion summoning with your opponent, which is absolutely critical in this matchup. Now for some decks with really bad matchups against Unchained. I would start by saying that Labyrinth is one of the worst decks to play against Unchained. The deck just targets a lot. Unchained is able to deal with that pretty easily, and they can link off with all the big lab monsters and pop Labyrinth's back row, so not the best situation. Rescue Ace is also very tough against it because it's a back row deck. All the back row decks kind of suck against Unchained, and on top of that, the deck does special summon quite a bit and targets as well, which means Unchained can kind of deal with it that way. So just keep that in mind when you're deciding what deck to play for the upcoming format. So that is it. If you guys enjoyed this video or you learned something new, then make sure to leave a like on the video. If we hit 75 likes on the video, I'll know that you want to see more guides on how to beat other meta decks. Of course, don't forget to comment other ways to beat Unchained that I might have missed or your thoughts on the video in general. And by the way, did you guys know that only 5% of my viewers are subscribed to the channel? So if you like the content, consider subscribing to the channel and helping us reach our end of the year goal of 2,000 subscribers. Thank you all so much for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you all next time.